This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform which allows entrepreneurs to create and customize their own personal or professional website. More on Squarespace later in the video.
So hello and welcome to another episode of Geographics. I'm your interim host, Karl Smallwood. That's Karl with a K, Smallwood with a small and then a wood. Yep, it's really spelled like that. This is not a pseudonym, it's my actual real name. Let's move on. And today we're talking about Per Lachaise, an icon of France. And something I like to do when presenting top 10s, geographics and biographics videos is give a shout out to the author of the script on which the video is based, because these videos are a team effort. Before I even glance at the script, at least half a dozen people have had their hands on it beforehand. And the person who wrote the script is one Larry Holsworth, who you can follow at the social media links below. And while I'm giving shout outs, I like to say hey to my co-host on Geographics, Eric Malachi, and one of the guys who works behind the scenes. Cheers for picking the script on that river in Ohio that caught fire and leaving me with the one with all of the French words in it. That was real cool of you. And speaking of French words, I have done my due diligence and double-checked the pronunciation of most of the words in this piece I was unfamiliar with, including the topic of today's video, Per Lachaise. So I double-checked, and people in France, and specifically Paris, do refer to it as Lachaise. However, some tour guides and documentarians pronounce the S and call it Lachaise. Then I found one person on YouTube who referred to it as Pere Lachaise, who got eviscerated in the comments by people with French names and flags as their profile photo, so I won't be using that one. But without further ado, let's get to it. Paris, France is world-renowned for its many attractions, which include the Louvre, the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, the Cathedral de Notre Dame, and many more. Yet, one of the most popular tourist attractions is, of all things, a cemetery, more accurately described as a necropolis, since it includes a columbarium, a repository for crematory urns. The Cemetery de Père-Lachaise is the largest in France, and as of 2022, the most visited cemetery in the entire world, with over 3.5 million visitors annually. Its popularity would be no surprise to its founders. It was designed for visitors first and foremost as the world's first garden cemetery, featuring wandering paths, plotted gardens and topiary, and eclectic statuary throughout its grounds. Among its attractions is the incredibly diverse nature of notables interred there. Among its graves are those of several marshals of France, singers of opera and rock music, philosophers, playwrights, poets, composers, industrialists and politicians, and many, many others, both deserving of fame and infamy. It also contains the graves of communists summarily executed on the premises. The site known as the Communards Wall is the location of an annual commemoration of the Paris Commune in 1871. Within the confines of Père Lachaise are the final resting place of those who died wealthy or penniless, beloved or notorious, and sometimes both. As William Thackeray noted in his novel Barry Lyndon, the personages there, and I quote, lived and quarrelled, good or bad, handsome or ugly, rich or poor, they are all equal now. Here is the story of Père Lachaise and some of its more memorable occupants. By 1803, the cemeteries within the French capital of Paris were full and surrounded by structures or natural boundaries that prevented their expansion. Accordingly, the then first consul of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, yes, that Napoleon Bonaparte, directed the establishment of new cemeteries outside of the city limits on land to be purchased by the city of Paris. The city government acquired land to the north and south of Paris for the creation of new cemeteries, and also purchased 17 hectares of land near Mont-Louis, east of the city proper, for the creation of what was then designated as, quite fittingly, the Cemetery of the East. The new property sat roughly 19 kilometres from the centre of Paris, though it was well known to Parisians of the day. You see, on the newly acquired eastern land stood a house which had been the residence of Pere, which is French for father, François de Lachaise, a Jesuit priest who, among his other clerical duties, had served as a confessor for King Louis XIV. No doubt the good father heard some, shall we say, interesting confessions given the life of the king he served. King Louis had no fewer than 9 illegitimate children, had an unknown but likely very large number of mistresses, even for a Frenchman, and thoroughly enjoyed, shall we say, just the pleasures of the earth. Yet, paradoxically, he was also a deeply pious man, regularly attending mass and receiving the sacrament, after cleansing his immortal soul through confession. Though several clerics occupied the house at Mont-Louis, which was then well outside the city limits, it became known to Parisians as Chez Pere Lachaise, after the most famous of its denizens. The name transferred at first informally to the new cemetery on its grounds. Napoleon, by then bearing the title and style of Napoleon I, Emperor of the French, opened the cemetery officially as the Cemetery of the East in December 1804. Its grounds had been designed and groomed by an architect And here's another great French word that Eric's got me pronouncing. Alexandre Theodore Brogniart, who would later design Paris Bourse, known today as the Euronext Paris, the second largest stock exchange in Europe. Brogniart envisioned the statues and monuments that would one day exist in the cemetery and laid out wandering pathways that divided the land into plots while providing access to each. He also planned gardens with diverse plant and tree life, creating botanical gardens to complement the future memorials. Napoleon himself is said to have toured the cemetery prior to its opening for its interments and pronounced himself well pleased with the architect's efforts. At its opening, according to the precepts of the French revolutionary concepts of Ecology, all persons, regardless of race or creed, were eligible for burial at the new cemetery. The Roman Catholic Church, offended by the idea of heretics and infidels lying side by side with good Catholics, refused to consecrate the grounds, which made it an undesirable eternal resting place for Catholics, but no doubt more desirable for anyone who didn't want to spend the rest of eternity next to a preachy Catholic. An 1805 change to the law allowed for designated areas within the cemetery to be designated for individual faiths. Still, the cemetery proved unpopular, with relatively few seeking interment there, in part because of its distance from the city. So I'm sure that whatever past tense Karl was talking about was very interesting, but current tense Karl has to take a word from today's sponsor, Squarespace, and for that I need help from my business anteater. Also helping me is some guys from behind the scenes, Brad and Nisha, because the work here at Geographics is a team effort and there are plenty of people behind the scenes, two of which are Brad and Nisha, who are helping me with today's sponsor. So tell me more about Squarespace as I pet my anteater's snoot.
So Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform used to create beautiful websites.
Website that makes websites. It never gets old. Website that makes websites.
But yeah, it's suitable for all entrepreneurs, amateurs, professionals, anyone can do it.
Amateurfessionals. Amateurfessionals. I'll get that word right.
So one of the things I think is a really good advantage is the Squarespace's next generation design system, which is called
the Fluid Engine System, which is just like, tech jargon for drag and drop. And drag and drop is so good. I love drag and drop.
And it's good because you can customize to desktop and mobile, which I think is because you don't realize how different it looks.
People don't, and it's just one of those things. They have like previews that'll show you this is what your site will look like on a phone. This is what your website will look like on an average size monitor. This is what your website will look like on a TV.
But if you're not too comfortable with starting with a blank slate, as it can be a little bit overwhelming when you're literally you can make anything. Your mind's like, where do I start?
And fun fact for everyone at home, this is something known as choice paralysis, and it's why sometimes you'll find yourself endlessly scrolling on Netflix, because an overabundance of choice can paradoxically make it harder to choose. So sometimes you need to winnow down your choices to just some preset templates which you can customize to your liking. And then once you're more comfortable with the system, then you can start to mess around with stuff with the fluid engine, which lets you drag
and drop. Another good aspect of Squarespace is you can get your viewers or your audience to subscribe to your mailing list.
Yes, and a mailing list sounds so archaic, but it's coming back. Because people are watching this on YouTube, and the people watching it, according to our analytics, you probably subscribe. But also according to our analytics, that most of the people who subscribe don't get served the content that they chose to subscribe to see. You don't get that with a mailing list. If someone signs up to a mailing list, as people probably find out when they accidentally sign up to one, you will 100% get that message in your inbox.
Yeah, which is great if you want to keep people updated with what you're doing, whether it's blogging, or, selling something, or, if you've upset?
If you've upset somebody, send a personal apology to every person who's subscribed.
Sorry. If you've uploaded stuff to an online course that you've made, that's what I meant to say.
If you've upset somebody with something you posted, you can send them a message with your mailing list.
So basically, you can just keep people up to date.
Is there anything sadder than an apology email?
No, a breakup email.
Oh.
So thank you to today's sponsor, Squarespace. Check out Squarespace at squarespace.com/geographics for 10% off your first purchase of a website/domain using the code Geographics. And a little tradition we've started with sponsor spots recently is sharing an extra bonus fact for everybody at home that's found nowhere else on this channel. So guys, would you like a bonus fact about how Gordon Ramsay once sabotaged his own restaurant to screw over a rival?
Yay!
So we all know Gordon Ramsay, right? We know
Who's that?
the angriest chef in the world, the man who like dominates people on TikTok, and
The way you described him, the man who can fit a deck of cards in his forehead.
oh yeah, the man who apparently looks like me, which I don't like. But before Gordon Ramsay was known as the world's angriest chef, he ran a restaurant called Aubergines, and in 1998, Aubergines was the victim of a very brazen crime where a masked man on a motorcycle ran into their restaurant and stole their bookings book. This being the days before electronic bookings, someone stealing the bookings book could cripple a restaurant, especially a restaurant as popular as Gordon Ramsay's Aubergines, because people could just walk in off the street and go, I've got a reservation. We don't know who you are. And Gordon Ramsay publicly blamed the theft on his rival and former mentor, Marco Pierre White, who denied having anything to do with the crime, although the press still ran with that story. And Gordon Ramsay would later gleefully admit that he orchestrated the whole thing just to make Marco Pierre White look like a douche.
God, Gordon Ramsay, more like Gordon Scamsy.
Oh! By 1817, the Cemetery of the East still had relatively few graves, at least in comparison to the other cemeteries established at around the same time mentioned earlier. Administrators devised a plan to enhance the cemetery as a prestigious final resting place for Parisians. One part of the plan was to transfer the remains of the great French actor and playwright Molière, who died in 1673, to an elaborate tomb upon the grounds. The administrators also arranged for the transfer of the remains of Abelard and Heloise, star-crossed lovers of considerable fame during their lifetime. So, anyone unfamiliar with the story, Peter Abelard was a 12th century composer, philosopher, poet and theologian who was credited with the development of the concept of limbo. That's the metaphysical state of being, not the game where you go backwards under a stick. Heloise was the love of his life and eventually his wife. Limbo, for anyone unfamiliar with the exact definition, was a Catholic concept of a place where the souls of the unbaptized, specifically those who died before the resurrection of Jesus and his offer of salvation for all mankind, would spend the rest of eternity. Subsequently, the souls of children who died before their baptism were also dispatched to limbo, not heaven, but not the hell of the damned either, because it seems like a bit of a move to do that, right? In the UK, we have theology as one of our courses in school, to make you a more rounded person who's aware of the diversity of culture in which we live. And just the idea of sending unbaptized children to hell was always wild to me. And apparently, it was quite a wild concept back then too, because Abelard's concept of limbo was controversial among Catholic theologians, among them the family of his love, Heloise. Heloise had been sheltered by an abusive uncle who disapproved of her relationship with the open-minded Abelard, and to prevent their marriage, said uncle hired agents to castrate Abelard. Both Abelard and Heloise retired to separate monasteries after that tragic event, though they were married and continued a lengthy and passionate correspondence for the rest of their natural lives. When Abelard died in 1140, his remains were buried at the Priory of Saint Marcel before they were exhumed and reinterred in what became the Abbey of the Parcelets, where Heloise resided. She was buried alongside him there in 1163, and then in 1817, to considerable fanfare we might add, their remains were moved to a tomb prepared for them at what was officially then the Cemetery of the East outside of Paris, but for the purpose of today's video is Lachaise. Abelard and Heloise developed something of a cult in the centuries that followed their death, similar to the fictional and tragic tale of Romeo and Juliet, or Dante and Beatrice in Italian folklore. Their tomb drew considerable attention from the lovelorn, and the tradition of leaving notes or poetry addressed to the pair at the tomb developed in the mid-19th century and continues to the present day. Yet there is some considerable debate over whether their remains actually occupy the tomb at all. For anyone curious, the Parcelet does claim that the remains of the lovers are still buried there at Lachaise to this day, though there are some that claim Abelard was removed to Pere Lachaise, though Heloise was not. Whether the lovers are buried at Pere Lachaise at all is immaterial. The tomb is among the more popular destinations for tourists at the cemetery and is a designated historical monument in France. To raise patriotic support for Pere Lachaise, its administrators lobbied for the tombs of heroes of Napoleon's Grand Army. No less than 14 marshals of France, military leaders who served under Napoleon I, are interred at Lachaise. Or perhaps there are only 13, with one monument marking the burial plot for the family of Joachim Murat, though the whereabouts of the marshal's grave itself is disputed, even to this day. Murat was not only a marshal of France, but bore the title of King of Naples, conferred onto him by the Emperor Napoleon. When Napoleon's empire crumbled in 1814, Murat, who had been one of the French army's most capable commanders, entered into a secret agreement with a coalition of Austria, Prussia, Russia, Great Britain, and then a couple of other countries not worth mentioning now, because they aren't in the script and I don't happen to have intricate knowledge of this part of history. Let's move on. So by doing so, he was able to keep his throne, at least for a little while. After Napoleon's exile to Elba, Murat attempted to strengthen his claim to the Kingdom of Naples despite British support of another claimant to that throne, Ferdinand IV of Naples. And let's just for a moment appreciate the balls on Murat for saying, I am the one true, heir to the throne of Naples, more so than the guy who literally has of Naples in his title. After attempting to enforce his claim to the throne through military action, as was his style, Murat was captured by Neapolitan forces loyal to Ferdinand. Ferdinand, supported by the Austrians, reasoned that Murat's claim to the throne was void since Napoleon, who had bestowed it upon him, had abdicated, thereby making it moot. Therefore, in his estimations, Murat was a traitor to Naples. Murat was tried for treason, convicted, and executed by firing squad on October 1815. Though his tomb is located at Lachaise, according to some, his remains are not, and their location is debated to this day. Another Marshal of France who died facing the firing squad was Michel Ney, called by Napoleon the bravest of the brave. Ney had been dispatched to arrest Napoleon as the Emperor travelled from Paris via the Grenoble Road following his return from Elba in 1814. With his accustomed bravado, Ney informed the French king, Louis XVIII, that he would return Napoleon to Paris in an iron cage. Legend has it that Napoleon and Ney reconciled in a dramatic confrontation in which the Emperor challenged his former troops to shoot the leader who had brought them such glory. In truth, Ney and Napoleon negotiated via dispatchers and messengers, and their two armies approached each other. The dramatic encounter on the Grenoble Road, in which Napoleon dared his former troops to fire upon him, was staged for the benefit of the French press. Ney joined his former leader, Louis XVIII again, fled to exile, and the 100 Days, which culminated in the Battle of Waterloo and Napoleon's final exile to St. Helena, began. Ney fought with distinction at Waterloo. After Napoleon surrendered to the British, Ney was arrested, charged with high treason, and ordered to stand trial. Denied the opportunity to enter exile himself, Ney was convicted of treason in December 1815 and sentenced to death. He was executed by firing squad on December 7th, and his remains were interred at Pere Lachaise. As time went on, the memories and glories of Napoleon's empire supplanted those of the sufferings required to support them. Several more of Napoleon's marshals of France went on to their eternal rewards, their mortal remains interred at Pere Lachaise. For the population of Paris, the cemetery became something of a symbol of French patriotism, the goals of the revolution, liberty, equality, brotherhood. The administrators of Pere Lachaise exploited the cemetery's popularity as a public resort, with maps marking the locations of the site's more famous residents, we guess. Its popularity with Parisians soared. This, let's call it what it is, aggressive marketing plan followed by the Lachaise administrators, coupled with a resurgent French naturalism in the 19th century, which made Pere Lachaise a popular destination both among tourists and for those seeking, shall we say, more permanent accommodation. The growth of the city of Paris also helped as the city expanded. The cemetery, once quite remote to the city, grew closer and closer to the urban core. The cemetery expanded in 1824 and again 5 years later, then 3 more times before 1850, when it reached its current size of 44 hectares. In 1810, a Jewish enclosure opened, surrounded by a wall which isolated its graves from the rest of the cemetery. A decade later, on the site of the former home of Pere Lachaise, a chapel was constructed and consecrated by the Catholic Church in 1834. It remains in use to this day. In the 1850s, construction of a separate Muslim enclosure at Pere Lachaise began, completed in 1857. Like the Jewish enclosure, it was isolated via a wall lined with flowers and shrubbery. This was the first Muslim cemetery in France. It was never really popular, and by 1870 only 44 burials had occurred there. In 1871, part of the Muslim enclosure was transferred to the adjacent Jewish enclosure, which had proven more popular with the citizens of Paris. In 1881, French law made segregation in cemeteries illegal. The walls that isolated the Jewish and Muslim burial grounds were removed, though the outlining shrubbery and floral beds remained, kind of as a reminder of what had transpired previously. As a result, today at Pere Lachaise, Jewish and Muslim graves exist, side by side, surrounded by emblems of peace and eternal tranquility. Emblems which, to date, regretfully elude the living members of their faves at far too many places around the world. Again, not touching that one with a barge pole, let's move on. By the 1860s, Pere Lachaise was the most popular Paris cemetery for burials, a privilege which has always been restricted to residents of Paris or those who happen to die while in the confines of the city. And it was already evident by this point that the cemetery had become a desired final resting place for the artistic as well as the heroic. In regards to the former, the great French writer Honoré de Balzac was buried there upon his death in 1850. So was Georges Bizet, a composer-conductor famed for his opera Carmen, which remains popular well into the 21st century. The great Polish composer Frédéric Chopin was also interred there, though without his heart, which is a kind of interesting story, so let's get into it. Chopin died in Paris in 1849, the causes of which are still debated to this day. He was buried at Le Chaise, though his heart was removed and sent to his native Poland. The heart has since been on something of an adventure, travelling to various hiding places to elude, among other things, communists, Nazis, and grave robbers who just want to have the heart of a great composer, I suppose. Chopin's body, in contrast, has remained at peace in Pere Lachaise, so maybe they should be reunited, because the heart, imagine dying and a part of your body goes on holiday and just has a better time than you did. The opposite of Chopin can be found in the story of French painter Jacques-Louis David, who created some of the most famous paintings in the Napoleonic era. David died suddenly in Brussels in 1825. He had been leaving the theatre when he was run over by a carriage. The driver did not stop to investigate the injuries to the seedily dressed painter. David, though a resident of Paris, was denied burial at Pere Lachaise, having committed the sin of participating in regicide during the Revolution. However, the authorities were merciful towards the painter's heart, allowing it to be interred in his wife's grave with her at Pere Lachaise, where it remains to this day. The first crematorium in France was built at Le Chaise, opening in January 1889. Along with its construction, the cemetery built a columbarium, essentially catacombs for the display of crematory urns. Eventually, the columbarium was expanded to the point where it could house over 90,000 urns. However, for decades, it remained almost empty. Cremation, for anyone curious, was quite unpopular in France until late into the 20th century, faced with long-standing prejudice by conservative Catholics. The columbarium is the site of a cenotaph describing the urn containing the remains of Maria Callas, the famed opera singer, diva, and consort of Aristotle Onassis. The cenotaph has led to many claiming that Marie Callas's remains are at Le Chaise. They are not, though they were until her ashes were stolen in 1978. The subsequent search and eventual recovery of her ashes remains shrouded in secrecy, an annoying amount of secrecy given it happened relatively recently. But when they were recovered, they were scattered in the sea in the Aegean, the waters in which she cruised aboard Onassis' yachts. And if you search around online, it's easy to find references to Pere Lachaise being the final resting place of Marie Callas, though the truth is that the cemetery is the final resting place of her empty urn, which is still there and can be visited. Marie was one of the latest celebrities to be identified with Pere Lachaise, which includes the still popular singer Edith Piaf. Piaf, who died in 1963, was one of the most popular entertainers in the world at the time of her death, and her grave remains one of the most popular at Pere Lachaise 6 decades later. Over 100,000 fans attended her graveside services, spilling over into the other gardens and parks surrounding the site for hours. Despite her immense popularity, Piaf's grave is not the most popular among visitors to Lachaise. That distinction belongs to the final resting place of American rock singer and poet Jim Morrison of the band The Doors. Morris died suddenly in Paris in 1971 and was buried without an autopsy at Pere Lachaise. At first, his grave was unmarked. When administrators did identify the grave via a plaque in 1973, it was immediately stolen by a fan. Later, a volunteer marked the grave with a bust of the singer, which was again immediately stolen by a fan. A second replacing it was defaced. Neighbouring graves were also damaged by vandals and litterers. Graffiti, discarded liquor bottles, broken glasses, and other debris marred the site. Eventually, administrators got sick of all this, fenced off the site, keeping visitors at a distance but not reducing their numbers. Pere Lachaise remains a working cemetery to this day and is still open for burials despite not expanding its land holdings since the mid-19th century, which probably has you wondering, is there even any space left? The answer is, well, yes, if someone who's already there hasn't paid their bills. So graves determined to have been abandoned by descendants are open. The bones are then located to the on-site ossuary, located behind the Horse Mort, to the dead monument. They are then sorted and held, and when the ossuary itself becomes overcrowded, they are cremated, the eldest being incinerated first, and then the ashes are then moved over to the columbarium. We're not sure what happens there when the columbarium is full, because as of yet it's not, but I imagine they'll just pour them down the toilet or something. And yeah, that's a whole thing. Moving back to the topic of Pere Lachaise, after a grave has its bones exhumed, it's then sold, though leased is probably a more accurate term, for periods ranging from 50 to 4 years. So I've been in this apartment for longer than 4 years. Anyway, for people who don't want to suffer the indignity of having their skeleton just dumped out of their coffin and replaced by somebody else, in some cases graves are offered in perpetuity, though plots so acquired come under the same demands for care, annual fees to cover maintenance of the grounds and plot as those offered for shorter terms. In this manner, about 100 new burials occur at Pere Lachaise annually, though there is a waiting list that people are, I'm not going to apologise for this, dying to get on. That's not even in the original script, presumably because the author was like, I'm not making a pun that terrible, and I'm like, no, don't worry, bro, I've got you. I will make this pun. I will go down with this ship. Cremations, on the other hand, require no such wait, regardless of whether the remains are to be held at the columbarium or otherwise disposed of by the mourners. For anyone curious, it is still a requirement to be either a resident of Paris or to have succumbed while in the city of Paris to be eligible for burial at Pere Lachaise. Pere Lachaise, as noted earlier, was the first public cemetery designed as a garden with flower beds, arbours, hedgerows, groves of fruit and nut-bearing trees and other amenities intended to create a peaceful and soul-soothing environment for visitors and mourners. The success of its designers is evident in several areas. Its popularity as a burying ground, as a tourist destination and as a favourite among Parisians for pleasant strolls and picnics. Their success is also evident in the ecological biodiversity exhibited within the site. Besides being the home of the famous and infamous, the wealthy and the poor, the profound and the profane, Pere Lachaise is home to an abundance of wildlife, including a large and diverse community of foxes, otherwise not to be found within the French capital. Over 100 species of bird can also be found there, surely a source of entertainment and frustration for the community of up to 100 feral cats, also known to reside on the grounds. Since the global COVID pandemic ended, Pere Lachaise officials have conducted a conscious effort to allow the cemetery to look altogether less groomed by the hands of humanity and more a product of nature. Wild clover and orchids, natural grasses and creeping ivies and other plants have seized a proportion of the landscaping, which lends to its otherworldly look. The shift to natural flora and fauna is part of a concerted effort to reduce the amounts of herbicides and pesticides in the soil, which led to the support of certain forms of plant life over other, which is kind of antithetical to the whole idea of just like, everyone being equal. It's like, just let nature grow where it does. In the 21st century, Pere Lachaise Cemetery is recognised as a major cooling centre for the city of Paris during the summer months. Over 4,000 trees on the ground serve as a carbon dioxide storage sink. The site is critical to the French capital's attempts to reduce its carbon footprint while maintaining a tribute in perpetuity to the notables buried therein. Pere Lachaise Cemetery has been something of a star in of itself for decades. As early as 1833, the aforementioned Honoré de Balzac described the site in detail in his novel Ferragus. For example, the fictional Jean Valjean of Les Mis is buried at Pere Lachaise. Gustave Flaubert referenced the cemetery in his novel Sentimental Education, once considered one of the most important novels of the whole of the 19th century. The cemetery is also frequently referenced in French song and poetry, in television and film background shots, and in tourist guides and day trip planners. It's considered to be an essential part of the modern city of Paris. It sits in today's 20th arrondissement, the administrative district of the city, serviced by 2 metro stations fed by 3 separate rail lines. In addition to its role as a necropolis, it's also the site of numerous monuments dedicated to veterans and victims of world wars, African tragedies and wars, aviation accidents, international crises, and labour crises and tragedies. According to its official website, which is fittingly named perelachaisecemetery.com, it offers, and I quote, the most hauntingly romantic walk in Paris, and it's hard to disagree. There are roughly 70,000 tombs, but over the years, reburials and cremations have led to roughly 2 million persons being sent to their eternal rest through the gateways offered by the once simple cemetery of the East. Along with Eiffel's eponymous tower, the left bank, and the Champs-Élysées, it's truly an icon of Paris, and indeed, all of France. So I hope everybody at home found this video to be entertaining, informative, and educational. If you are inclined to agree with that sentiment, you can let the author, Larry Holsworth, know at the links you can find below. And no doubt there's some other stuff you can click down there or somewhere on screen that will help support the channel. Because as mentioned in the intro, at least half a dozen people get their hands on this script before I even lay my eyes on it. And after I've recorded this video, at least another 3 or 4 people are going to touch it before it goes out to you, the audience on YouTube. So yes, cheers to everyone for watching. And as I always like to say, go out there and have the day that you deserve. Cheers.